Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 17. We're going to be looking at sections 2 and 3, talking a little bit about global economic systems and the Atlantic slave trade. So, when we talk about slavery as an institution, one thing I really want you to understand is slavery has existed for a very, very long time. And you can actually go through and look at the Old Testament of the Bible. And you can find a lot of different examples there. But needless to say, when we get to around the time of the 1500s, where we're having more explorations, more desire to expand agriculture and industry, slavery kind of takes a new emphasis during this period of time. So, the Atlantic slave trade did originate along the triangular route that connected traders in places like Europe, Africa, and then to the Americas. And a lot of this is kind of dealing with the trade of a handful of items. Typically, when we talk about Europeans, uh, they are producing things like guns. Uh, they have final production of products like rum and textiles, which are like cloth or clothing, are things that they are making within their nations. Africa is providing the labor source. And a lot of this is coming as a result of the fact that when Europeans came to the Americas, they brought disease, and many of the people living in the Americas, our Native Americans, our first peoples, did not have uh, the resistance or the tolerance to those diseases and succumb to those things. And hence, we were looking for a labor source, and Africa provided that labor source. From the Americas, our slaves are going to help with the production of agricultural crops like sugarcane, cotton, and tobacco. And those products are going to be sent back to Europe to be sold to Europeans. And this cycle is going to perpetuate itself for many, many years to the point where it actually becomes kind of the go-to as far as the business model. It's going to uh, basically have an impact on things like mercantilism and such. So, going onwards, when we talk about slavery, it is the practice of owning slaves or a person who is owned by another. And as I mentioned before, this is introduced many, many years before the Atlantic slave trade actually took place. It was not introduced by Europeans when we talk about the continent of Africa. For years, you had different warring tribes, and as a result of winning battles and such, those people who were the losers were typically taken in as slaves. A lot of times, they would be basically taken as a prisoner, and then over time, they could be bartered, sold back and forth, traded amongst people, maybe even getting back to their own tribe at some point in time. Europeans, as far as looking at this slave trade as a model for their economics, they were definitely eager to trade guns for people. They knew the value of that because when we talk about our European explorers, they knew that there were certain peoples who had never seen gunpowder or what the power of a gun could do, and they knew that that would be something that people would want. The Americas, for the most part, were being developed, and we needed the labor source. African mines and also plantations were developing. When we talk about gold and talk about diamonds, Africa today is still one of the biggest producers of those items. When we talk about plantations, not only in the Americas, but will eventually be plantations that are going to take place or take shape in the continent of Africa as well. And we also had the disease issue, as I mentioned before, among Native Americans who were not tolerant to diseases like smallpox. So, becoming a slave, how could you become a slave? It could be through warfare, it could be because of heredity, meaning that your mother or father was one, so thus you become one. A raiding debt, you could sell yourself as a volunteer or an indentured servant, or it could be because of a criminal punishment. When you talk about getting out of slavery, time might be part of that. It could be because of marriage. If you are a woman and you marry a man who is not enslaved, that might give you an opportunity to get out of that. Doesn't work so well if you are an enslaved man and you marry. It's very, very difficult in that regard. Military success could also get you out of slavery, or paying off your debt would be another way. When we talk about bondage, I do want you to understand that, when people were enslaved, it was not necessarily a very pleasant experience. You see kind of the yoke that's being used on these two men in the bottom left hand corner. Very common practices to use things like that to keep people from escaping. If you put two people together, it's a little harder to run away than if you have just one individual that's enslaved. As far as the ships that were used in triangular trade, the goal was to put as many people onto a ship as possible. And as a result of that, we're going to have some issues with sanitation and disease. And in many cases, those are going to be some of the things that are going to cause problems when we talk about the triangular trade and the journey. As far as European slave traders, the height of this was really between the 1500s and 1800s. Countries that took place or were involved in this were like the Portuguese, the French, the Belgians, and the English. Spain, to a certain degree, but not necessarily on the levels as the previous four that I mentioned. There was a desire for land and gold among our Europeans, and that kind of made them a little greedy as far as wanting to expand the slave trade. Merchants, as far as going inland into the continent of Africa, rarely did so because they were afraid of disease, but they were also really kind of unaware of what lingered inside. Years ago, there was a book called The Heart of Darkness, and it talked about the region of the Congo River and how many Europeans were just really scared because of the thick jungles and the fact that they didn't know, maybe some of the routes. So instead, they hired others to go in and kind of do the dirty work as far as uh, getting the slaves to come back. And a lot of times they would use individuals who were Africans themselves to go in and do kind of their dirty work and then bring them back to the coast where they could be processed and put onto these slave ships. Countries wouldn't give money for further exploration, so Europeans eventually traded guns with African merchants, and obviously that uh, provided an advantage for some tribes. If they had gunpowder, they could beat another tribe, and hence they could sell off their enemies to these different merchants. They could make money. Companies would only buy and sell slaves, and hence that's kind of uh, the, the really the kind of the evil side of all of this. When we talk about the slave ships and things like that. Not uncommon that you're going to see people that are going to be um, beaten if they try to escape. In some cases, you have situations where people might have been thrown overboard, like you might see in the picture there. But more often is the case, people probably weren't thrown overboard unless they had died. And certainly there were times when there were deceased people on these ships that were chained to other individuals who were going to be enslaved that weren't really discovered until they reached the Americas. And so when you think about the smells on these ships and just the awfulness that was happening, I mean, it just is beyond what one could really fathom. When you talk about the passage, okay, the journey from Africa to the Americas kind of has a name, and it's known as the Middle Passage. And it's a not necessarily a well documented number because some of these um, slave merchants obviously were not keeping good books, and some of the books have been lost to history. But it's estimated that somewhere between 11 to 50 million slaves were taken to the Americas. Some of them ended up in places like South America, like the country of Brazil, many into the Caribbeans, into some of those islands of the Lesser and Greater Antilles, and then eventually into places like the United States. Anyway, the cost for transporting slaves was pretty high. You had to have translators, meaning that you had to have people that could communicate with those people who were being enslaved. You needed to have food because you didn't know how long this journey would take. Depending upon the tides and the weather, you could be at sea for a few months, and you needed food for those people who were enslaved because you didn't want them to die on the journey because that's your profit. You needed firewood, you needed other things to kind of keep everything going. And so it was costly to do that. Many slaves were captured and torn from their families. And, you think about this, it was possible that you could take a family and divide them. And in a sense, you could take a situation where a family that had been close, had never been apart, are just divided up among these different traders, never to see one another again. Some were marched right to the ships after they lost a battle. Many of our slaves were branded and chained when they got to the port. Part of that is to make sure that they, were marked as far as being part of the property. The ships themselves were very crowded, as you can see in this um, photograph here of a model of a slave ship. At the same time, many of our enslaved people were forced to wear, um, certain things if they were known as an escape risk. And all that was very uncomfortable. By the 1800s, this would probably be the time, obviously, after our American independence. Great Britain and the US did pass laws making slavery illegal. When you talk about the United States, the importation of slaves was actually forbidden after the year 1808 as part of a compromise for getting the US Constitution passed. But it didn't necessarily stop the practice of slavery. We're going to have to fight a civil war to make that happen. I do want to draw your attention to the photo that's kind of on the right side of your screen here. When you talk about those slave ships, people were packed in there as tight as you could imagine. Um, it's about profits, it's not about comfort. And so literally people were, head to toe, um, just very, very uncomfortable quarters. If you could, possibly imagine that. One of the things that you would notice on that middle passage is that occasionally when people would die and they would be tossed over the ships, you would find that many of these ships would be followed by sharks because of the fact that there was, unfortunately, a food source that was available. So it kind of is a very grim kind of side story there. Anyway, problems with the slave trade. You created slave hunters. You had battles that were really not necessary, but they were there because somebody knew that they could profit from what happened in the end. You had raids of different villages. You had hostilities towards different groups that had at one time probably been very friendly with one another. Obviously, families were torn apart. Probably the number one thing that really hurt the continent of Africa is this issue of depopulation. Those people who were the healthiest, the ones who were probably the strongest, the able bodied, were taken away. And so what was left are the elderly and the very, very ill. And that causes some issues, especially in these regions that are near the coast of Western Africa. You saw, this as being, a real detrimental effect on these different civilizations. When you talk about Europeans and Americans as far as the consequences of slavery, for the most part, when you talk about our impact, slavery did, for the most part, remain on the west coast of Africa because that's where these Europeans were pulling people. But at the same time, many Europeans and Americans really know very little about African culture and saw these people as being, for the most part, subservient to themselves. And that has created a problem. It's bred prejudice. And this is something that we're still dealing with in this day and age. If you go back and you look at the contributions of many African cultures, you'll find that Europeans benefited from that. When you talk about things like mathematics and language and engineering and ecology, unfortunately, it's going to take a long time for us to kind of come to that conclusion. When we talk about explorers, some very well noted explorers of the African continent, you have Prince Henry the Navigator. He, for the most part, was one of the first to circumnavigate the continent for the Portuguese. He kind of outflanked the Muslims by doing that. When you talk about Mungo Park, going back to the 1790s, he is the man who basically followed the Nile River to its source, and he found the source of the Blue Nile. Hence, this is going to become important as far as the British, as far as their uh, desire to control the river for trade and such, and why at some point in time the British are going to want to colonize that. David Livingstone, who is kind of a well-known fellow because of some of the craziness that happened in his life. He kind of starts off as a missionary, and during his lifetime, he crisscrosses the continent of Africa, and in that time, he maps out the continent. But what's interesting is, at some point in time, he's going to disappear for a while, and people start worrying about him. And at some point, the newspapers are going to hire someone to go out and find him. And eventually, Livingston is going to be found. And what's interesting is, he kind of has adapted to the cultures of the different tribes that he is living amongst. But needless to say, I think Livingston, for the most part, is the guy who really kind of helps us understand what Africa is all about. And if it wasn't for him, we probably wouldn't have some of the knowledge that we have today. And then finally, we got John Haining Speke. He is the man who found the source of the Nile at Lake Victoria and is given credit for that. All right, resistance to the Europeans. At some point in time, the Europeans are going to want to colonize and carve up the continent of Africa. And you're going to find that there's a handful of different groups that are going to come in here. If you look at the map on the right hand side, you'll see that the British, the French, the Germans, the Spaniards, the Portuguese, the Belgians, um, Italians, and such are all going to try to colonize at different points. But there is one nation that remains, or actually two that kind of remain independent, really throughout this era of imperialism. One is a little nation called um, Liberia, which is kind of on the western coast of Africa. It was recolonized by Americans. And then off on the east coast, you have basically Ethiopia. At some point in time, the Italians are going to try to take advantage of that, but that's going to happen closer to the time of World War II. Anyway, during British rule, the British governed Africa indirectly through kind of handpicked African leaders. They strengthened the political and economic ties at the expense of those who were natives of this land. The British had always been in favor of this idea of mercantilism, where you kind of hold a monopoly on trade, and the British certainly were interested in that. When the United States was kind of in the thick of the Civil War, the cotton trade was really jeopardized for the British, and the British were known for making textiles out of that cotton. And so they were having to find other sources for that. And Egypt just happened to be the perfect place to raise cotton. And certainly keeping their hands on that territory was a huge um, issue for the British. When you talk about the French, they ruled by assimilation. Assimilating basically means that you try to introduce your culture to these new peoples, and over time, they are going to eventually speak your language, follow your religious traditions, follow your political traditions, and the next thing you know, they're going to be just like the French. Well, it's not as easy as it sounds. So, needless to say, the African colonies Yeah, they might have adopted some of the language, but as far as culture and things like that, that's really hard to change. So, needless to say, it kind of sounds great in principle. It doesn't always work as well as maybe some expect. The Belgians, I'm going to tell you right now, this is probably the most brutal of all because they used exploitation. They took advantage of the region around the Congo, or what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. They established plantations for rubber trees and plants, and they certainly were very brutal. People who were working in these plantations were whipped. In many cases, they were tortured. Individuals who tried to run away or to speak out, they might lose like a hand or a leg. Um, as a way to punish somebody who might have run, the torture might have been taken out on your child. Uh, for the most part, probably one of the most brutal examples of Europeans trying to rule over an area. Over time, a more humane system would be established, but it's really hard not to focus in on all the horrors that came out of this. The Portuguese, they ruled places like Mozambique, Angola, Guinea. Early on, it was harsh and brutal with forced labor and whippings and beatings, much like the Belgians. During the 20th century, Portugal worked on assimilation like the French, and they granted citizenship, and they eventually allowed for freedom of religion. And this allows for some of our people of the continent to continue some of their old traditions. Germany, they ruled for a while, primarily in the southwestern part of Africa, Togo, Cameroon. Like Belgium, they were using forced labor, but they also established public works projects. Um, in time, they kind of ruled indirectly by using African leaders to kind of rule in the name of the Germans. But when World War One comes to an end, a lot of the territory that Germany held is going to be lost. It's going to go into the hands of the French, the British, or Belgium. The Italians and the Spanish, the Italians, for the most part, they conquered or tried to conquer Ethiopia and Somalia. Ethiopia never really falls into the hands of any European nation, but Somalia does. And that's kind of on the Horn of Africa along the Red Sea, kind of into the Arab Sea. When you talk about Spain, they ruled Morocco and Spanish Sahara, and for the most part, over time, they're gonna eventually give Spanish Sahara back, but it's gonna take time. South Africa, this is a very unique situation. In 1647, the first Europeans settled there, and it was partially because when they were going around the Cape of Good Hope, some of the ships were wrecked, and a lot of these ships were heading towards the Orient to trade goods and such. But when these sailors returned home to Holland, they decided that South Africa would be a really good place to build a supply station, because if they are going to be traveling to the Orient, they need a place where they can get supplies and maybe rest if the weather is bad. So in 1652, roughly 60 settlers went to South Africa and they built a supply station. They were all told not to establish a farming colony. Well, that's what they did. They all kind of ignored the claim, and they claimed all the nearby land, and they established a farming colony. These settlers are going to be known as the Boers. Okay, it's a Dutch name for farmers. By the 1790s, the British and the Boers went to war. And at some point in time, the British are going to kind of get the upper hand. You got to understand, at the time, the British were one of the I guess you could say they were the world superpower. They had the guns, they had the boats, they had everything they needed to make this work. And so the Boers went further inland. And this all starts around 1806. The British took over what is known as Cape Colony or Cape Town. The Boers moved further inland to avoid the British. And eventually, for the Boers, this is known as the Great Trek. This is going to be the start of a situation that's going to be really kind of unique, but also really sad. The British and the Boers are going to really dominate the politics and the way of life in South Africa. And unfortunately, they're going to implement some policies that are just really awful. All right. Thank you very much.